Now we're doing a proper full review of the $5,000 Alienware R13. If you've ever wondered how important thermals are exactly in a computer, this is a perfect example of it, because in this chart, just look at it. Look what Dell does to the 12900KF. They've effectively turned it into a 12700KF. So we're off to a great start, because the Alienware R13 has taken a $570, very good, very high-end CPU and turned it into one that's a $340 CPU. Still good, but that's hugely wasteful. So we're gonna be talking about that. We'll also be talking about Dell's CRYO-TECH cooling. Except, not that we'd know, but there's no cryo anything in it. It's just water. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs, and has been used in several world record scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we've shown in the recent past now with main gear, with SkyTech, with ABS, it is possible to buy a pre-built gaming computer that's actually good. You don't have to DIY. Obviously, we encourage that. That's what our channel's all about. But if you're the type of person who really just wants to buy the computer and be done with it, or if you are the expert and your friends or your family are asking you what to buy and you don't want to become their tech support, everyone who works here has been through that, then a pre-built computer also makes sense. Our goal is to find one that doesn't suck. This one does not meet that goal. The Alienware computer at $5 grand is offensively bad. It is insane. It's actually incomprehensible. I can't think of the words for it, for how Dell has managed to take such high-end parts as an RTX 3090 and an i9 12900KF. Those are the two core components in here, and they have dunked on the performance of those two components just by building a computer poorly. Dell doesn't even make the silicon. Dell doesn't make the CPU. It doesn't make the GPU. All it has to do is build a computer correctly and have it function well at the end of it. So the hard part has been done by other companies. And Dell's method of assembly, which is to use very slow DDR5 4400 memory or DDR5 3600, yes, that is actually a thing that is manufactured. Didn't know it went that low. Those are your two memory options. They put a 120 mil closed loop liquid cooler on there that is shoved into an 80 millimeter mounting slot and stuffed behind 3 layers of metal, plastic, and glass or acrylic. So we talk about all the mechanics of this in a separate teardown video. It is fascinating how this was assembled. Genuinely, this is a real compliment. The mechanical engineering on this is masterful and brilliant, and it is applied in the most inept, asinine way possible. But in this system alone, there is a proprietary, meaning unusable in any other circumstance except for Dell's components, another Dell Alienware R13 build. There's a proprietary case, cooler, because not only are the tubes oddly short, but also it mounts to the case. There's, instead of using a backplate, which is what Intel uses, there's a proprietary motherboard where the I/O comes out the front. That way, if you ever have damage or a dead port, you have to replace the entire motherboard and not just a PCB daughter board in the front panel. And there's a proprietary power supply, so up to 4 units, because the power supply is not ATX 12VO. It's not quite the right size for that, and the pinouts are different, despite it also being a 10-pin. The rest of the components, fortunately, can be salvaged. That leaves you with the CPU, the video card, which is actually not bad by Dell standards. We tested it previously. It did pretty well. And then the RAM is technically salvageable, but not particularly good. Enough of that. We need to prove why this deserves a little bit of exaggeration and hyperbole, because the benchmarks and the objective data really back up the subjective conclusions on this one. Let's get started with some throttling numbers for performance. First up is Chromium Code Compile, where we're using the Chromium code base and measuring the time required to compile it in minutes. Lower is better. The normal 12900K takes 48.6 minutes to compile this code when stock. With the 12700K, which has fewer E-cores and slower clocks, taking 56.5 minutes to complete the same compile. As a reminder, the KF and the K SKUs, they're all the same other than the IGP, which is irrelevant. The Alienware R13 takes an embarrassing 56 minutes to compile the same code base with the same methodology. So Dell has chopped off 16% of its performance potential because of its own thermal and power limits. Dell has demoted its i9 12900KF it sold us to the same class of performance as a 12700K. In Blender cycles, the 12900K finishes the GN logo render in 9.4 minutes normally, with the 12700K taking 11.5 minutes. The Alienware R13 required about 11 minutes for the same render, meaning that Dell is incinerating a possible extra 14% performance for nothing. So much for the CRYO-TECH TM. Now, this doesn't always happen. In short tests like 7-zip compression, the test can complete within the 56-second window, and the results end up looking the same as a normal 12900K in those instances. So Dell can have normal performance, but only if your work or your game lasts under 1 minute. We need to start with the horrible thermal solution for the hottest CPU and GPU on the market right now for desktop. It advertises its new custom-made, ultra-short-tubed, closed-loop liquid cooler as, quote, the next step in the evolution of cooling, calling it CRYO-TECH, trademark, and saying it, quote, offers gamers significant thermal advantages. Now, not that we'd know, but we're pretty sure that the word cryo doesn't just mean water mixed with propylene glycol. Not that we'd know. Anyway, Dell goes on to brag about how its CRYO-TECH TM cooler, quote, features a 120 by 120 by 30 millimeter heat exchanger and a pump that operates at 2800 RPM, as if that's supposed to impress us. Quote, the heat exchanger is 11% higher than what's available on our standard liquid cooling unit, while the pump's duty cycle is 6% higher, also compared to standard liquid cooling. So here's what we have to say about all that. The RPM number, or at least the boasting of it being a little bit higher, is irrelevant. And the radiator is a standard size. In fact, it is the smallest mass-produced size on the market, and yet Dell has somehow gone in with the intent of trying to make it sound larger than it is in reality. A 120 mil radiator is not special or large in any way whatsoever, and the 120 millimeter mounted fan is attached ultimately to an 80 millimeter hole, which is also problematic. As for the RPM number, so pump RPM does impact performance a little bit, especially in large liquid loops where the water has to move around quickly because it does start to heat up a little bit. We've actually seen impact there. In this loop, what they're doing is they're bragging about a 6% higher RPM. That is within standard manufacturing variants for an Asetek liquid cooler, which is what this is. This is a rebranded Asetek liquid cooler, and their pump RPM manufacturing variant is plus or minus 10%. So Dell is claiming to be 6% higher. Okay, now you move the plus or minus 10% maybe a little bit higher up the stack, sure, but it's still within the original variants functionally. And even if at the high end you end up with an extra couple percent on the pump RPM, it doesn't matter here. With a full system workload, the maximum CPU core temperature quickly spiked to 96 degrees Celsius and was continuing to rise when Dell's custom 56-second PL2 window ended and the CPU's power limit was reduced to 210 watts from the original 240 watts. Wow, that's great cooling with the CRYO-TECH TM cooler, only 96 degrees, 4 degrees below extreme thermal throttling. Awesome. But the default behavior for the 12900K is actually infinite turbo, except the R13's cooler is insufficient and cannot maintain the 12900K's official Intel guidance and spec, and so Dell reduced the power limit from infinity, which again is how it's supposed to be shipped, to 56 seconds. That is quite the reduction in time. Infinity is a very long time. 56 seconds is not a very long time, scientifically speaking. The reported PL1 limit then dropped linearly from 210 watts down to 160 watts, where it remained for the duration of the test. The CPU is hard throttling and dropping clocks even with the revolutionary CRYO-TECH TM cooler with a 2800 RPM pump and an 11% larger heat exchanger, aka a radiator, than what's on their standard liquid cooling. Don't want to know what's the standard one then. So with the CPU hard throttling and dropping clocks, it effectively reduces it a few classes down from the 12900 KF you actually bought to something far cheaper. And we'll look at those numbers in a moment. The 160 watt number brought temperatures down to a steady state 87 degrees Celsius, which is still unacceptable, especially seeing as 160 watts is close to the power we'd expect to be pulled by an i7 11700K, one generation older and an entire step down. Certainly not an i9 from the 12th gen. Dell basically pre-programmed power throttling for the CPU because it knew it would thermal throttle otherwise. This liquid cooler is incapable of cooling the 12900 KF at a sustained 241 watt power limit, and also the 210 watt power limit, basically the 160 watt one as well. Removing the front panel reduced the peak CPU temperature down to 94 degrees and steady state down to 77 from 87 previously. The closed-off case design is a major obstacle in addition to the undersized CPU cooler. The fact that the CPU's power limit has to be adjusted down to pretty close to a 12600K is just outright embarrassing. As you saw earlier in Chromium Code Compile and in some other tests, it ends up being pretty close to a 12700K's performance. Still a good CPU, but you're really overspending on it. So let's see what all of this does for the frequency behavior. The i9 12900K starts out at about 4760 megahertz for the performance cores. This is where it would stay if Dell had cooled the system properly. But instead, it hard power throttles to keep thermals from running away. The result is a fall to 4200 megahertz, which is a 560 megahertz reduction just because they couldn't be bothered to cool the system properly and implemented their own custom power throttles. That loss of frequency is huge, and it demotes the i9 12900K to lower performance levels that we'll get to soon. The E-cores also drop, falling from 3900 megahertz to 3300 megahertz. That's another 600 megahertz reduction, just like in the P-cores. Alienware has used its extraterrestrial technology to transmorgify the 12900K into basically the behaviors of something like an i7. This is all just unbelievably wasteful. Dell is putting these extremely high-end, good, expensive components into a system that underperforms. It's sad that some customers may not even realize that they bought high-end parts only to be throttle blocked anyway. And Dell does all of this talk these days about how environmentally friendly it is, which would be awesome. We are hugely in support of that. We've given a lot of money to charities for e-waste because Dell contributes to it so much, and its competitors. But what we're seeing here is complete ignorance and Dell contradicting itself, where it's bringing down the performance of an otherwise high-end CPU, which is wasteful. Now for the GPU. The R13's case is the same basic Aurora design that we saw with the R10. The square interior of the case is tilted at an angle for aesthetic reasons, creating wasted space at the corners and making the inside of the chassis small relative to the actual size of the system externally. The GPU, in particular, has 1.5 centimeters of clearance for its fans at best. This doesn't bode well for thermals. It's going to be similar to running an air-cooled GPU smashed up against the glass. The front panel has 3 layers of plexi, plastic, and metal in front of the front fans. Plus, there's a large PCB housing LEDs and the power button, yet there's no filtration. GPU thermals relied heavily on increased fan speeds to keep the temperatures down. With the front panel on, we saw a steady state temperature of 72 degrees Celsius after an initial bump up to 74 degrees before the fans compensated. It seems like Dell's 3090 keeps to a maximum 70% duty cycle when below 75 degrees Celsius. But as we'll see in a moment, the fans are allowed to ramp much higher once that threshold is passed. With the front panel off, the initial temperature bump happened to hit 75 degrees through normal variance. That slight difference triggered an exaggerated fan ramp up to 87% or 3600 RPM and a period of hysteresis before settling at about 70% at 71 degrees. It's almost the exact same as the stock test, but with some excursions above that speed. The problem here isn't the fan ramp. It's that the case is constructed in such a way that high fan speeds are necessary and therefore high noise to keep temperatures safe. Although the vBIOS should be programmed in a way, ideally, where there's a step somewhere between 70% and 87% speed to reduce how noisy and noticeable that ramp is. As for noise, the R13 is loud. We can hear the pump noise constantly, there's coil whine during gaming, and the mechanical hard drive adds that mid-2000s gateway vibe. Here are some examples. And the whine is mostly coming from the motherboard VRM, but this is the main problem. This thing is loud in a lot of ways. As for objective noise, idle is about 31.5 dBA in a noise floor of 26, but the R13 blasts to 49.7 dBA peak to try and compensate for thermals with limited access to air and cooling. It settles at about 45.5 after the boost expiration, so this is just poor thermal and acoustic design. Gaming is short for this one just because testing a $5,000 pre-built against a bunch of $1,500 pre-builts is pointless. It's obviously going to be better. That's why we tested it versus a properly assembled 12900K and RTX 3090 using the stock guidance instead. It's the same config, it's just that we built it to the standard spec instead of the R13s. In Cyberpunk, with our test settings at 1080p, we saw the CPU frequency limitation in full effect. In this CPU-bound test, you'll notice that average FPS is about the same, but the DIY system pulls ahead in 0.1% lows. This indicates better frame time consistency and pacing thanks to the frequency. At 4K, it's GPU-bound and they run about the same for performance. As we showed before, Dell gets credit for building an RTX 3090 that's actually okay. That shows here. So good job on that part, Dell. Now just do that for everything else, please. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the CPU bind illustrates the R13 falling behind, allowing a 5% lead to the more standard approach. We'll stop the gaming test here since we're not recommending the system on many grounds anyway, but we wanted to give you a quick look as to this end of things. For power consumption, the R13 contains a CPU and a GPU that both have reputations for extremely high power consumption, but also high performance. That does, however, indicate that they are less efficient than their lower-end counterparts. Starting with our extended blender test, the immediate full system power draw was 394 watts, well beyond the already inefficient 10700F based Aegis R's power draw of 275 watts. Even with the significant reduction in the power limit following the boost period, the R13 only came down to 292 watts average. This is still higher than the peak power draw of any other system on this chart, and that's, again, entirely because of the components. It's not necessarily a bad thing to draw a lot of power for high-powered parts, as long as the conversion to performance is at least somewhat efficient in terms of perf per watt. Based on what we saw in the torture test, we would expect the full system power draw to level out at 260 watts over a long period of time. Gaming tests add the power-hungry RTX 3090 to the mix, with the Rainbow Six Siege testing averaging 546 watts. That's a lot higher than the next entry on the chart, especially given that level of performance that the CRYO-TECH Chronos offers for 350 watts. Cyberpunk was significantly worse, with the R13 averaging 641 watts due to a shifting bottleneck. In contrast, the Main Gear Vibe, for example, is a mid to high-end gaming system that pulls 352 watts on the same test. It's also lower end, though, in terms of the GPU with the 3060 Ti. All of that said, the R13's efficiency, so the performance per watt consumed, is overall poor relative to the performance offered compared to a properly built 3090 plus 12900K system. As for peripherals, the default option included a mouse and keyboard, and opting out of both would have saved us a total of $10. Wow, thanks, those are quite the quality components. That said, we also don't think they're worth even $10 after having used them. We'd recommend opting out. You'll reduce the waste. You'll probably just buy better components anyway, especially if you're spending $5,000 on an Alienware gaming PC. Alienware branded peripherals, like their mechanical keyboards and headsets, can also be added to the order as separate items. They claim they offer a discount as well. Our one deviation from the default options was to opt out of Dell's perennial bullshit scam, the auto-renewing subscription support fee. They've gone back and forth on this feature. It changed after our first Alienware review and rant about the subscription warranty support, and it changed between the time we placed our order for this PC and the time of the writing. It will probably change once again by the time we publish. The page layout was a nightmare when we ordered. Seriously, watch as we scroll down past the easily comprehensible hardware options to the warranty and support section. It should not take more than 5 seconds to figure out how to not pay for this. As of this writing, the $10 per month premium tier can no longer be selected, and the cheapest option is a one-time payment for the premium tier. The Alienware product page only shows prices plus or minus relative to the sticker price, so it's unclear whether the cheapest mandatory support tier is actually free or not. And that's not a mistake. This is intentionally confusing to trick you into buying an additional warranty. You already have a warranty for buying the computer. That's something they offer. This is just extra. Time for BIOS and software. We noticed that absolute tracking software was enabled by default in BIOS, although it's also listed as deactivated. The description checks every box you'd want for paranoia and even includes a tinfoil hat. For example, there's an option to ping a server on a regular basis. There's tracking the system. There's forcibly reinstalling the software from a module on the motherboard. That's one of the more concerning ones. Maybe this is part of the Premium Plus service package that we opted out of. And if so, we are happy to have avoided it. If you care about telemetry, and you buy this computer, at least disable all of this stuff if it's not already deactivated by default. XMP was not applied, but that's because the memory sent has no XMP. There's still an option for it in BIOS, so it should work fine on memory that does contain profiles if you buy it separately. The memory was set to 4,400 megatransfers per second. This is what Dell advertised. However, the sticks themselves are rated for 4,800, so there's performance on the table here. As for CPU overclocking, OC LV1 was applied out of the box with no explanation at all of what that is. Setting the OC level to custom exposes some extremely basic controls over ratio and power limits. No antivirus requested was the default option when we placed our order. And this is actually awesome. Good job, Dell. You did this one right. There wasn't even a free trial of McAfee on the system, just plain old Windows Defender, which is what we want. So good for Dell for dropping AV bloat. Seriously, they should be encouraged for this. Because of this, Dell's bloatware rating isn't quite as bad as it could be. There's still Alienware Command Center, Alienware Mobile Connect, My Alienware Registration, and Dell Support Assist all popping up notifications and creating backups that we didn't ask for. But AV is normally the largest contributor to performance loss, and they've gotten rid of that one at least. So that's it for the Alienware R13 review. Let's recap a couple of the quick things. The biggest issue is the frequency dropping. We'll put that back on the screen briefly. The frequency drops as a result of a power limitation that Dell has instituted in BIOS. So this is not an Intel thing. Intel official guidance on the CPU that is sold in this computer, the i9-12900KF, it's the same as the K, just it doesn't have an IGP. The CPU officially should infinitely turbo. That means that the turbo boosting duration is forever. And because of that, the power consumption is high forever, for as long as it's turbo boosting anyway. So you're in the 240, 241 watt range when it's turbo boosting. And turbo boosting meaning that the frequency is boosting to one of the highest bins possible across however many cores you're using at that given interval. And when you go in and you implement power limits, so PL1, PL2 usage at 56 seconds is what we observed for the first massive drop. Then there's another one a little later where it ends up at 160 watts ultimately. What happens when you implement these power limits, these hard power throttles, is that technically speaking, the CPU is not thermal throttling. But that's a really tricky use, really conniving way to implement the word technically here. Because yes, it's not thermal throttling because you are power throttling it before it can thermal throttle. And you're power throttling it because it will thermal throttle. 96 degrees Celsius is what this was running at when it was within the 56-second boosting window. So in less than 1 minute of full system load, the CPU was almost at TJ max, which is the maximum junction temperature of the CPU before it begins to thermal throttle to protect itself from getting killed by runaway thermals. So Dell is triggering a power drop, and that power drop is triggering a frequency drop, and that frequency drop, and we'll pop it up again, is triggering a performance drop. So again, just to recap it, in Chromium, we see it reduced to the level of a 12700K instead of a 12900K. In something like 7-zip, however, which completes rather quickly in our testing scenario, the performance is about the same as the fully unthrottled 12900K as it is on the Dell version, because the boosting doesn't really come into play because the test duration is simply not long enough. So in any task where you are loading the CPU for more than a minute, you're going to start seeing performance reductions and performance clawed away from you that you would have on basically any other computer, including other pre-builds with the 12900K, if they are built properly and if they are built in a way where they don't have to power throttle to circumvent thermal throttling. So if you ever have anyone ask you how important is temperature really in a computer, this is the video to send them, because it's a fantastic educational example at Dell's expense, unfortunately for them, of what really happens when you have built yourself into such a corner that you are forced to reduce the performance in order to keep it under control. So that's pretty much the core issue, is the performance. We can complain all day about proprietary motherboard, proprietary power supply, proprietary case, proprietary cooler, and how silly it's built in general, how it's brilliant mechanical engineering shoved into one of the most contrived computer builds we've ever seen. But none of that really matters quite as much as the fact that you are paying close to $600 for a CPU, which you are not really able to use. You are only getting, say, $340 to $370 of value out of that CPU in the applications where it is throttling to a point of becoming an i7 instead of an i9. And you'll get value out of the i9 for 56 seconds. So, my question, obviously, to Dell is why? Why would you do this to yourself? Because you're still putting the expensive stuff in there. Obviously, the customer pays for it too, so that sort of cancels out. It's simple arithmetic there, but that's basically how it works. And yet you are not delivering on the performance capabilities that another company has built into their product that you are buying from them. So Dell doesn't even, you don't have to do the hard work here. All you have to do is cool it. And all that requires is pulling your head out of your ass for long enough to see that there are different ways to make a case than there were in the 90s. Now, we talked to some people in the industry, and our best idea for why Dell might do all of this is that they simply, and it's not just tooling, they simply don't want to recertify a new case for EMI, or electromagnetic interference. You have to pass certifications to sell in the US, probably in the EU as well, and EMI is one of those certifications. And one of the easiest ways to deal with it is to just have something that has already passed and continue to repackage it, which is what's happening here. You're bolting a bunch of plastic to something, and probably the plastic helps with passing EMI testing as well. So that's the best idea we have for why they would do this. That is not, it's irrelevant to the consumer though. I don't care what the manufacturer's viewpoint is if the product is beaten by all of its competitors. It just doesn't matter what Dell, how it defends these choices, because clearly competitors do a better job. So we'd recommend looking at Main Gear if you are interested in a pre-built computer. We just reviewed one of theirs. It overall was actually pretty good. We would generally recommend looking at CRYO-TECH and ABS. ABS is owned by Newegg, so keep that in mind. Some potential issues there, but Alienware is not on our list. One final note here too. I've sent an email to Dell's PR team and said, hey, we can fly out there and talk with you all. They wanted to talk to us about their Dell cam because they said we got it wrong. They said it's not proprietary. Technically, in that sense, they are correct. It's not proprietary. It's just that Dell is making a technology that would rely on its competitors implementing and adopting in order for it to be functionally non-proprietary. And normally it doesn't go that way. Normally the competitors don't work with you on your competing technology because they don't want that in their system. But anyway, we'd be happy to, Dell, we'd be happy to talk to you about cam on camera, and you can correct us all you want. But I would like to talk about this. So that's fair trade. You could give your story on why you think cam is the future and why you think your concept laptops that are modular, which are clearly a first in the market, are good for the environment. And then I can ask you about how this is good for the environment with all the plastic, the actually proprietary parts, and the irreplaceable parts. I'd be happy to have that conversation. I'm happy to be proven wrong. Let's sit down and do it. I can fly out in 2 weeks. Check your email. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Don't buy this trash heap. Buy something else instead. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out in buying things like this so we can keep giving you reviews. We have another $5,000 computer coming in. I think it's pretty good. I hope so. Also, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our mod mats, our toolkits, or our coaster packs or shirts, and we'll see you all next time.